Logical Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. Although you may not realize it, you don't live in the current moment. In fact, a recent scientific study demonstrated that we actually live roughly 15 seconds in the past. The reason for this discrepancy comes from the fact that the human brain is bombarded by too much sensory information at any given time. In order for the mind to make sense of all this content, the brain smooths over sensory information, making it easier to comprehend by integrating it with old data received prior. Perhaps you don't believe me, or maybe you feel a bit shaken. Either feeling stems from how we perceive reality. All right, so I sent you this study earlier in the week, and it's sort of a difficult thing to conceptualize. There's probably a lot of listeners that are saying, well, that doesn't really make any sense, right? Like, you and I are talking right now. If we were living 15 seconds in the past and I asked you a question, you'd have to sit here and wait, and then you'd answer, right? That's not necessarily what the study was saying.
No, that's not what it was saying.
And the article itself had a very good visual representation where how they came to this knowledge was part of the experiment was they had a picture of I think it was a bumblebee and something else, and then they tracked how the human eye took in the picture. Yeah. And then based off of how the eye focuses and how it moves and all this stuff, what they realized is if you block out a lot of the peripheral content and just focus on where the attention was focused, it seems completely erratic and almost impossible to comprehend what's going on.
Yeah, I think that the very helpful model suggestion that they had was just turn on your cell phone camera and video capacity and hold it watching yourself as you're walking along and just normally looking at things where you go, and it's jiggly and everything's moving and you're glancing, you get a little picture of a wall, you get half a face of somebody next to you, and then it takes that 15 seconds for our brains to put that together into a picture that we're really not seeing in real time because we get fragments. We get half, and so we're filling in. Our brains do this wonderful filling in of details.
Right. And so what the study is saying is not that we're living, not that we're necessarily living 15 seconds in the past, but that a lot of our information, we've talked about this in the previous couple episodes, you have sensory information, and sensory information is completely separate from how we construct reality in our mind. So what the study is saying is the sensory information and then how we're integrating it, the integration isn't using all of that sensory information. It's using a very little bit of the sensory information, but then it's pulling on sensory information from the previous 15 seconds in order to fill in these gaps and create a cohesive picture. It's weaving a tapestry of reality.
Yes.
And it's not doing it with the information that you're processing in that moment. It's using it with information that you're processing in the past several moments.
And yes, and you're explaining that well, and extending that, we have to realize we're not talking about a static moment. We don't have static moments. We are constantly in motion. The brain is therefore constantly remaking the picture. It's really fascinating because it does connect with phenomenology, with how we actually, as you say, construct. The word construct is important to linger on. We build, we make what we're seeing. The capacities of our own senses, our own machine, if you want to call us a meat machine. I don't like that term, but I know people use that. All right. Whatever else we may be, we are a package of senses. And so we are constantly making this picture from all these tidbits of data that are just clearly not accurate. I mean, if we stood on out in the front of your house in the mountainous snow and took one glance from left to right and then one glance from right to left and then quizzed each other on what we saw, we probably would not list all the same things.
Yeah. Yeah. And this has happened to me in everyday life. And it's probably happened to other people where if you drive a certain route, let's say to work, right? I worked second shift for a while. So I'd leave in daylight and I'd always leave in daylight and I'd always come back at night. And I'd drive the same route. Well, occasionally in the course of other events, on the weekend or doing something, I might drive the way that I'd normally drive home in the daylight. And you see things suddenly that you go, oh, I didn't know that was there or whatever. And it's the same route that I've driven in the daylight going to work, but coming back is a completely different experience, even though it's the same road because it's from a different perspective. Mm-hmm. And we'll get into this a little bit later. It's super fascinating, and I think that the little vignette here that we had at the beginning did an excellent job of introducing this topic. So, what is reality?
Well, there's the question. When we were doing the pillars, we would come to this topic occasionally. We have dwelt upon it before, and there of course is argument because there are many viewpoints in a philosophical viewpoints in as well as I was about to say non-philosophical, but I think it's really hard not to be philosophical.
Yeah.
But there are those who assert that there's an exterior reality that is independent of us. There are those who assert that we are really making the reality ourselves. And then there are those who are in that mushy place in between, essentially. So we can say, well, we know that there are stones and rocks and boulders and piles of snow and cars going by. But then we have to say, well, yeah, but how much of that do we really know? We know that we have had experiences with these things, or we see them and we think they are what they are. But sometimes you might see something and think it was a rock, and it turns out to be a shadow cast by something else. I've had those in driving, particularly the optical illusions, which point to the illusory nature of, I'm so sure that somebody's about to step out in the road and it's a mailbox. I'm so sure that I've seen a figure when I've seen a short street lamp. And what we're doing is taking that patterning that we have built into us. Things that look roughly like arms and a roundish head must be a person. But then it's not. And so I can't look at that and say, well, I knew what that was because I didn't.
Yeah. And so this introduces like an extra layer onto that vignette that we were talking about earlier, right? So scientists discovered, right, that we take our sensory information and we're integrating it with the past 15 seconds of sensory information that we've received. But really, we're going back even farther than that, right? Because we've all had that experience. And, driving late at night is one that will do that to you, or catching something out of the corner of your eye is something that will do that, where probably what's happening is your brain, you're seeing sensory information in the moment, and then it's taking the past 15 seconds, whether it's your motion or the thing's motion, and it's telling you, okay, well, this shape combined with this motion is going back into our long-term memory and schemas and saying, this thing's a human that's about to walk into the road, right? And this brings up a very interesting phrase that the article that I sent you used, which was, if we weren't integrating that 15 seconds to smooth over that information, to create this cohesive reality, we'd be in a constant state of hallucination.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And that is very wild. And that's kind of what we're describing right here. If your brain, which is it's an imperfect machine, right? If you receive this sensory information and then you integrate it with the past 15 seconds, and then you pull from your long-term memory schemas and it's inaccurate, it gives you an inaccurate picture, you've essentially hallucinated what happened. You saw, right? You knew that you saw a person walking into the road,
Right.
and then a second later, you didn't.
And I didn't. And it's a jarring experience because it makes you question. Am I losing my capacity to? Well, no, I'm not losing my capacity. It reduces with age, apparently, but it's not that. It's not really where it fits. It's that my brain is putting it together, and the closer I get, the more details there are. And I think this is universal to humanity. And I'm not about to sit at this mic and say to somebody who may be living across the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean, well, I know what you experienced. No, I don't know what you experienced. But I think humans overall experience this. So I can't point out a specific thing that a listener might say, no, I don't drive, so that doesn't go with me, but I take mass transit. Sometimes do we think we're going to a door that turns out to be a window because the door is just a little further down? Do we misjudge how many steps there are? I've done this too. If I'm going rapidly up the stairs in my house and I know that I counted those steps long ago when I moved to the house, but does that mean I count every time? No. Can I step and miss a step and hit a second step and be off kilter for a moment? Yeah, because my brain's not reading it. I'm assuming, and based on past data, and it's constantly shifting.
Yeah. So this is really great already, right? Because we've taken something that people are very familiar with in a concrete sense, and we've opened up question after question about it, and that's a good place to start.
It is.
I like if you Google reality, right?
Mm-hmm.
I like the definitions that come up. The first one is the world or the state of things as they actually exist, as opposed to an idealistic or notional idea of them. To me, that one is a little bit arrogant.
Yeah, it has that. Yeah.
The second one is it says the state or quality of having existence or substance, which is another interesting one. By the way, if you just Google reality, your results might be different from mine based off of your algorithms and whatnot. But the first thing that pops up is what to watch under reality TV, which is an entirely other fascinating topic.
Well, and which isn't reality.
Right, exactly.
And it makes a case because says that up front. It's pretending to be reality, but it isn't because it's still curated.
And now we're using reality in a different sense, right? Because it is technically reality TV. Like, well, there's people out there in real life that are doing this, but the content or what's trying to be portrayed is in some ways a facade. So yeah, again, here we go, giving you peeks down different rabbit holes than I think we're going to explore over the next several minutes. But we'll start in the beginning with the general concepts before we get down some of these rabbit holes. Yeah. And I think that these definitions really give us a keen insight into the next question I'll ask. So with that first definition, the world or the state of things as they actually exist, as opposed to an idealistic or notional idea of them. Yeah. Well, that's presupposing. The next question would be, I think the one that we have to start with is there really something at all, right? And this is a question that we've explored over the past several
episodes. And it still keeps coming back. It comes back not because we're trying to harp away at it and kill it dead by over talking because you really can't. Does something exist? Well, that causes one to have to define the word something. Now, this very process, I'm going to take an aside and say, in the culture in which we're living in the United States, at least, you can have people automatically saying, all right, I hear this in the back of my head. You're an elitist. You're trying to question everything. And questioning everything, you're taking away the stability of our life. We know there are things, there's the table, there's the chair, and just leave it alone. No.
Yeah, I think there's a funny comic where it said, I forget who the philosopher in question was, but it says if you hit him in the head with a rock, he'd know that it was real, right? Yeah. And that's not something to be taken lightly, right? But at the same time, with the concepts that we've explored, talking about epistemology and ontology and some of these other things. And even with the examples that we've provided thus far in this episode, right? If you've gotten this far and you're not having some sort of question about reality, well, you probably haven't got this far. You probably turned off the podcast. If you're still listening, you probably have some sort of question about, well, what is reality? And that question, if you follow it down a Socratic trail, is going to be, well, is there a reality?
Well, this is, and so one of the current philosophers, Raymond Tallis, writes very interesting books about perception. And his most recent one that I'm aware of, he talks about the philosophy of perception begins usually with the argument from illusion. And so that encompasses the idea of hallucination, but hallucination and illusion are not the same things. So he says we can have experiences of objects. So the stone you just mentioned, or the table, but we can have experiences of objects that aren't there. I'm taking us for a moment, the little asterisk, a little reference to a discussion we had about dreams. More than once. Things that aren't there, and yet they are, because they're constructed in our minds, or the mailbox that was in my mind a person.
Right.
Or you're in the, let's say, why does horror fiction work so well, or movies? Let's say, so I'm walking through the woods and I hear a snap or a crack or a pop. And let's say it's really early in the morning. The sun hasn't risen. I've been out doing photography of the stars early in the morning. It's lots of fun. And I have a woodlot. And sometimes I'll hear this crack. Now, what's the first thing that happens to me? I think, is there danger?
Right.
And I immediately then think, that's a deer out there. It's walking through the woods. They've left the spot that they obviously sleep in with all the, you can see the evidence under my spruce tree, and they've gone out into the woods. They're snapping. There's other animal life out there too. Are they after me? No. But you hear that crack, and your mind goes from the stars and the camera, and you put it down, and you're looking into the shadows as if you could see something. And what is it I'm going to see? With my eyes, am I going to see a fully realized deer? No, not at that hour in the morning. I might see a shadow moving. I'm tracking the thing by the sound of what else, the other twigs cracking. So there's an element of illusion in that, because I'm building a deductive case for what it could be, but I couldn't say I know what's there.
Right. And so, yeah, this idea that we've been exploring of this construction of reality becomes very interesting. And there's been a lot of psychologists that have explored this, a lot of philosophers that have explored this. One of my favorite studies, and you can find video examples of this being recreated online, is the fake arm study, right? We've talked about it before, where you put up a partition so a subject can't see one of their arms. And then you put a fake arm in view of them, and then you kind of groom this fake arm by, touching the real hand and the fake hand in the same spots for a certain number of time. And then what happens is the brain incorporates this fake arm into part of your body. That becomes part of your reality. And then they'll do things like hit the fake hand, and the person will experience real pain, right? If that doesn't make you question how you perceive reality, almost nothing will.
Almost nothing will. Have you ever? I'm sure people listening, some of you have done this. You take a stick and you put it into water, and depending on the conditions of the light, what do you see? Yeah,
you see the stick. You see the other half of the stick, but it's not connected to the piece that's in the water because of the way the light is.
Right, and then sometimes it even bends. You're putting it straight down into the water, but you're seeing it bend.
That's illusion.
It's right, but it's the physics of light. So, am I seeing the object as it is? Well, the part above water, perhaps. So that arrogant little thing at the beginning, or the reality as it really is.
Right.
Okay. But the sticks under the water, I assume that pretty well because I've put it into the water, and yet it's doing something that it shouldn't do. Or you take. I had a friend in junior high school who did junior high school things, as we all do, and he had this over and over again. He had to take a pencil and shake it, holding the pencil in its center and then vibrating it so you see the pencil wiggling around. And after a while, it got annoying because he's saying he's asking this marvelous philosophical question. See, the pencil turned into rubber, didn't it? Is that rubber or is it a pencil? Well, I didn't have the capacity back then, but no, of course it's not rubber. Or you can look at it and say the first time, wow, how'd you do that?
Right. Yeah, it's your mind smoothing over what it's seeing because there's just too much information, right?
Yep.
So in our quest to try to determine, is there really something, and we've brought up these marvelous examples of illusion, of hallucination, of our brains very obviously misinterpreting what's going on around us. That raises the question: is there only one reality?
Well, and this is what some other articles that we've talked about this week have come out with, that they're. The multiple reality thing, which sometimes we talk about in quantum physics terms as multiverses and whatever, but we don't even have to go there. Are there multiple realities? Well, there are multiple perceptions of things. Take a boulder in the daytime, in the hottest day of summer, and touch that boulder and see what happens. And probably silicates are within it, and you're seeing all kinds of amazing details, shadows, convexes, concaves, and then go to that boulder in the wintertime. And it may be frost covered. It may have the hoarfrost on it. It may have snow on it. Find the boulder at night and see how much of it you can actually see. What's the boulder like in the rain? Are all of those perceptions accurate? If so, is that boulder all of those things, or does that boulder give the appearance of all of those things because of the states of the environment around it? And if it changes perceptually, does it mean there's only one boulder?
Yeah, and there might be some listeners that are thinking, well, I've got the answer to this, right? There is one boulder that exists in reality, and really we're just looking at reality at different points in time and, integrating different complex interactions of the environment to perceive it. But there is one boulder. Well, this raises an interesting question, right? Because at the beginning of the episode, we talked about how our brain is using the past 15 seconds to construct reality.
Right.
And something that you said stuck with me, which was that there is not really a current moment because we're always moving through time, right?
Yeah.
The interesting thing, right, if you look at physics, is that if you zoom out far enough, and we have plenty of, observational evidence to show this, special relativity and things, there is no distinction between space and time. Space and time are one thing. And if you stretch this out far enough, you can kind of come to the point, especially if you have an infinite universe or a multiverse or something like this, where time actually doesn't have an impact on what you're seeing, right? It's almost as if you know how we've probably always seen these kind of trippy sort of psychedelic effects where it'll be a video, but rather than something happening, there's a tail, right? So that first image that it took stays, and then the next image that it takes stays. So you have this stretching sort of effect. Mm-hmm. It's almost what physicists suggest reality is like at this zoomed out scale. So this boulder that presents itself differently at different points in time, the key word there is at different points in time. And scientifically, looking at things using the knowledge that we've acquired, it's not so certain that time would have anything to do with the reality of the boulder.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take out time as something that's contributing to the reality of that boulder, but the boulder is presenting itself differently at different points, is there one reality in which that boulder is one thing? Or is there multiple realities that this boulder exists in, and it's different things in each one because it's presenting differently?
Well, here's where I think, for me, this is where it merges between the interior and the exterior. There are many realities of that boulder from my experience. I'm talking about this because I have some glacial dropages, boulders left behind from long ago. And they are new every time I see them. People love dolmens and henges and so on because of the stones. Why? Because the shadows, the textures, the different conditions of the weather bring out that, and the daylight or the starlight, dusk, dawn. So all of those are conditions, environmental conditions. But let's say that the boulder exists and it's one boulder, but it's still not the same boulder, because now we're back to Heraclitus and we're back to the ship of Theseus, because it too is eroding. Pieces may crack. A crack may form and may pop off. An image of Scrat from Ice Age just happened into my head, which it's a delightful little movie. Anyway, so, I think that in the interior, which is where I think that the article goes with the 15 seconds, and then another that we're referring to from Scientific American this past week about reality itself. It's multiple within us, whether we think about it in terms of psychological state, in terms of physical state, what are the levels of our chemistry and electromagnetics at any given moment. Are we tired? Are we wide awake? Is it possible to miss things even if we're wide awake and notice things when we're tired? Yes. So one doesn't necessarily mean a diminished capacity. It's just an alternate capacity. So we see many different versions of that so-called one thing, even though that one thing itself is changing. This is back to the 15 seconds. If we stared at that boulder and then we actually looked at a picture of the boulder being taken by a camera, we wouldn't necessarily see the same details. That boulder would have changed slightly in those 15 seconds, but we didn't pick it up.
Yeah. And so I'm sitting here, I'm looking at my computer screen, monitoring the recording that we're doing, right? And I'm seeing the sound waves go up and down and these sorts of things.
Yeah.
My brain is integrating all that information to create a sound wave, to create a timer so I can see how much time we've spent all these things. But in quote unquote reality, what I'm looking at is just an amalgamation of thousands of tiny little lights that are flashing one of three colors, a red, a green, or a yellow, in various combinations in order to create shapes, right? But my brain doesn't see that. I don't see thousands of little lights that have no relationship to each other. It creates this cohesive whole. So is the reality what I'm seeing on the screen, or is the reality what's happening at this microscopic level? And if they're both true, is that actually two separate realities, or is it the same or different, concepts or facets of one reality, right?
Yeah, if it's a macro monistic, I'm just making this one up. If it's a macro monistic reality that would encompass all of the changes, then that would suggest that from beginning to end of time of all things, all of those changes on everything down to the particles and the atoms have been recorded. Well, how are they recorded? Something,
Yeah. And we talked about it a couple of weeks ago with quantum computing, right?
Yeah.
So I have a regular computer, and that's pretty easy to understand, right? We have electrical pulses, and it either gives you a 1 or a 0, and that creates everything on the computer. Quantum computing, we don't know how that works.
No,
really.
no.
And we got this huge accolades for having 99% accuracy, which is completely unacceptable in traditional computing. So there's all these things going on. Another interesting article that I was reading this week, because Google knows me so well and suggests all kinds of things that it knows I'll like, was talking about animal intelligence, which I harp on a lot, right?
Yep.
And the perspective that these scientists were taking was that the reason that we perceive ourselves as being the only animal with intelligence or consciousness is because we have an anthropic principle, right? This sort of idea that because we have a certain type of an intelligence and consciousness, that is the standard to which we set when applying it to other animals.
That's right. The universe was made for us.
Right. But in reality,
that view.
Yeah. But if you, in reality, you look at different animals and the ways that they, their sensory information, the way they integrate that information, the way they perceive reality, and the way they use that information, lots of them are much more intelligent than us in different ways, right? And so their conception of reality, an interesting one to me is that there was a fascinating episode on Netflix. I can't remember what it was called. I've talked about it before, though. But it shows you representative samples of the world through different creatures' eyes. Right?
Yes.
And, the fascinating things, a mantis shrimp and a hawk and all these different things. It's all very different. And so these creatures' perceptions of what's really out there is completely different from ours, but it's still accurate. Mm-hmm. They're using different sensory input to come to different conclusions about the same world that we live in. What does that say about reality, right? And they asked the scientists, they said, and the disclaimer he gave every single time before showing you the video of what the world looks like between other creatures' eyes is, this is just our closest approximation. We can't understand it this way because we are interpreting this sensory data with a different brain. The brain that is designed to interpret this data would see something completely different from what we're seeing. What does that say about reality, right? And whether there's one cohesive thing or whether there's multiple different ways of looking at it. And an article that I was just reading right before the show, I mentioned it to you. I was in the middle of lifting some weights, and I went to lift a set, and I came back and my phone had locked, and I unlocked it, and the article had refreshed and disappeared, and I couldn't find it again. But what they were talking about was looking at the world through a quantum lens, and how it's much like looking at a marble statue. To say that there's one statue is sort of erroneous because you're seeing this statue from a single perspective. They said, if you look at the fine detail and the softness of the hair, or you look at the musculature of the body, or you see the jawline from a profile, you're seeing something totally different, and that actually constitutes a different reality. And this is an approximation of another philosophical argument with the three blind men and the elephant, right? This idea that, they all think that there's three different animals, right? Oh, it's a long, snake-like animal. Oh, it's this tough,
columnar pillar-like thing. Yeah.
Right. It's all referring to this concept that where do we draw the line between saying that there's one cohesive thing with constituent parts, and where do we say that there are individual constituent parts that we are sort of artificially constructing into one cohesive thing? It's a kind of a chicken and an egg argument.
And you just landed us, which I won't do right now, but you landed us into a totally down on the ground view into what happens when people on any part of the planet say, well, this is what our country is. I am a citizen of this, and this is what we're about. Oh, yes, but what is your perspective? Does that allow for any other perspective? Is there only one way to view what and it's the same thing you just said very articulately, but applied to a sociological, political perspective.
Yeah, and it goes to show how, things that you are told, you can't escape that cultural context. I can't escape that cultural context, right? We have these philosophical conversations where we attempt to observe things objectively. But like you were saying, if you are told from the earliest age that America is a melting pot, you sort of incorporate that into how you think about America, when in reality, you see the amalgamation of cultural and racial characteristics, and you see how just distinct and separate they are. And you realize, well, really, that's what you've been told is almost antithetical to the reality of it. And a lot of the reason it is that way is set by the same people who are telling you that it's a melting pot. A personal example is, yesterday we got, about 1.5 feet of snow here, and I'm out shoveling at 4 a.m. in the morning so I can get to work on time. I'm thinking, when I'm doing it, I'm thinking, why am I doing this, right? And the first answer was, well, there's people at work that rely on me, right? But that is sort of a heroic answer that doesn't really portray the whole story. And eventually I'm out there shoveling in the dark by myself, sort of chuckling, because I'm thinking, it's capitalism. There's a company that's telling me I have to make stuff. And as a result, I have to sacrifice hours of sleep, and I have to put my safety at risk to drive there and to do this stuff to make things for people, right? And it's like, wow, yep. Even us armchair philosophers who look at this stuff week in and week out aren't, we don't live in a bubble, right?
Of course not.
We're influenced by these.
We would be useless if we did. We are part of what makes it an animated and interesting discussion, and why we invite people in every week is to in the hope that it's going to spark more discussions between them and friends and family, or just within themselves. That's what we do. We do not live in a bubble. Well, or do we? If space time gives, never mind. I won't do that right now. But a bubble. What does a bubble imply? Bubbles are pretty fragile.
Yeah, you know what? Yeah, let's go there then, right? What if I ask the question, what exists outside of reality? Is that a question that makes sense?
It is a question that makes sense if we go to a couple spots. One of them, if we acknowledge that, if we posit the idea, let's go with it for a moment, work with the definition, we'll change it altogether. But positing that reality is that state of things that we see that changes moment to moment because of our 15-second lag, because of our all of our senses, whatever they may be, whichever sentence we have at this point in our lives, what we are constructing, what we are experiencing. If that's how we're defining reality, then there are, of course, things outside of reality, because we're talking about our own reality.
Yeah, so let's go back to some traditional definitions again, because I think that's going to help us. When I was looking it up, one of the definitions that they gave was reality are things, again, that actually exist. And some things that don't constitute reality are imagination or ideals or this sort of stuff. What would you say about that? Is that accurate, or is that...
the reality doesn't encompass imagination? No, I'd say that's enormously imperialistic and arrogant, as you said before. No, of course, because do we have an imagination? Yes. And if somebody wanted to counter me on that, I would have that discussion with them. But I'm saying my answer is yes, we have an imagination. It functions constantly. Whether we're making up novels, whether we're drawing, whether we're daydreaming, whether we're dreaming, we have an imagination. And then further, we are complicit in saying to other people who make movies, whether it's horror movies or superhero movies or life movies, I'm going to go with you on this, that we're going to go on this journey together with these characters who don't exist, and the situation that happens that didn't exist. But wait a minute, what about the movies that are docudramas? Okay, so they have some elements based on a real story. Okay, so this is based on a real story, which is already implying that it isn't, and yet I'm spending time with it. Why? Imagination must be important. And if it's just for kicking back and relaxing, that still has a use. And does it have to have a use? Not necessarily, but if you want to argue that it does, kick your feet back, relax, and enjoy Netflix. All right. So, no, imagination is part of the construction of our very reality as we perceive it through our senses.
And that argument makes sense to me, right? Because you've laid it out really well, which is, that our mind, we're using information that we have from other things, and we are having this sort of interaction with it. But now it comes back. So that definition that I gave and that explanation that you gave brings us back to the question, which is, if imagination and ideals and these things are reality, then what exists outside of reality? Is there something that exists outside of reality?
I think following all of that, it would be, but it's certainly there's many philosophical positions. And one of the philosophical positions is the things that we don't encounter are outside our reality. The things that we, so it's as much as to say, I might know, we talked about this before, that the Eiffel Tower exists. I'm reasonably certain it does. Right. Do I know the Eiffel Tower? No, I do not. Have I experienced it? No. And so therefore it's outside of my experiential reality. And I think if we start defining those things like experiential reality and using those, this is where if we can all recognize that we have experiential realities and that they are different among us, then we have a place at which to discuss why your experiential reality and my experiential reality may be vastly different. But does that mean that we have to treat each other as alien life forms and either wish each other's demise? Or does that mean we've got plenty that we can discuss?
Yeah. Yeah, and so your Eiffel Tower example, that was back to our discussion of a priori and a posteriori knowledge.
Yeah.
And I think the question that I asked at that time was, if even if you haven't seen the Eiffel Tower, if we're still considering that a posteriori knowledge because we've used our physical senses to view a photograph or a video or something like that, with all of our technological means, all the things we've experienced, what could we call a priori knowledge? And I think that a similar question sort of develops here, right? If we look at, like you just said, examining experiential knowledge and how each individual person has a different experiential knowledge, it sort of comes back to that question, right? If I'm looking at my computer screen and there's 1,000 little lights, but there's one cohesive whole, are those 1,000 little lights, or is that every individual person's experiential reality? Is that reality? Or is there a cohesive, overarching thing that we're all experiencing, even if some of us are interpreting it wrong, or if each one of us is interpreting it differently from our perspective, or all this stuff? But is there one reality out there that we're all experiencing in some way?
I would, I know how I would have answered this as a much younger person. It would have been with perhaps too much certainty. Well, of course, I can't say that anymore. Right. Well, wait a minute. We all experience breathing. Yeah, but not the same way. So to what degree does that matter? If somebody has an oxygen device, I know a number of people who do, and that device keeps them going. Their experience of breath and my experience of breath are necessarily different. Is the breathing happening? Yes. But I'm not sure how useful it is to say, well, see, we all have that in common. We breathe.
Yeah, I think it comes back to the unavoidable characteristic of human beings to categorize.
Mm-hmm.
And I think categorizing comes from that consolidation and synthesis of information. And because we can't handle those individual constituent parts, that sensory information bombards us, it overloads us. So our brains come up with a way of smoothing things over and integrating and creating categories to make something understandable.
Yeah, I think the categorization element is desperately important. I'm going to just weave another example here. Let us say that grass exists. Okay, some of us mow it, but some people live in places where grass is very long and very different, or grass is seldom seen. So there's that kind of knowledge thing going on there again. But let's say, well, we turn at nighttime. Does the grass look the same as day? Does it feel the same as day? Does it have the same characteristics as it does on a hot day, cold day, snowy day, whatever? And so to say grass exists can be useful as a touch point for a discussion that pulls the different perceptions together. I don't see a use for it other than that. To be honest. Okay, well, sure, it exists. What are we going to do next?
Yeah.
It's why we have this necessity to assert, why we have the necessity to create a category leads us, unfortunately, being humans, to often assert that our perception of whatever that is the reality. And that is where we've made so many mistakes daily in our life on this planet. That's why, to me, it's important. So we're bantering around this idea of, do we have a reality? Well, that's important to do. But it's particularly important to me because it brings us right back to, can we understand each other better?
Right. Yeah. And this idea of categorization, right? Grass is a good example, right? Depending on where you live or where, what you're seeing, you could say grass is green or blue or brown or yellow,
sere.
Or it could be bamboo is a grass. Technically, there's this categorization when you get to the scientific level. You have animals like platypuses, right? Which we all joke about, like, well, how do you categorize something like this? Well, that's where categories, it's this visceral encounter with the limitations of categorization, right? Mm-hmm. And one of my favorite just simple things to ask is, what's the difference between a bush and a tree? Right? And then you have this idea, okay, you see a bush lining somebody's white picket fence, and then you see a tree with its crown of, maple leaves or oak leaves or something. Well, one of my favorite pieces of plant life to see around our area is the smooth sumac, right? They're just very cool and kind of alien looking. Well, the smooth sumac, I look at it and I go, man, this is sort of a bush tree. Like, it doesn't really look like, it looks like a mix of both of them. It doesn't look like either one. Yeah. And a very simple question like that, right, opens up this sort of meta-analysis of how we define categories and how those categories influence how we interpret real life.
Or how we, and I'm going to interpret and take it a step further, because I think, again, this is where we hurt ourselves as a species. When we come to the point of saying, well, there is this category, so there's either this or that. This falls into this is this tree bush of yours. We'll just bring it down until we can finally figure out what it is, because we're going to nail it down. Why? Because we want to be certain. Why? Because we're scared to death of uncertainty. And when we see that the world is uncertain all around us, the first primal instinct seems to be to try to assert a certain reality that must be adhered to, because that'll keep the ghosts and the goblins away, because those ghosts and goblins are bad. Why? Because we say so.
and this is a scientifically observable phenomenon as well, called cognitive dissonance, where whenever there is something that conflicts with somebody's already established worldview, they must the instinct is to immediately establish a new concrete knowable position. And this gets us into an interesting topic of conversation that you and I were talking about right before the episode, which is how technology is affecting our experience of reality and how it's affecting our interactions, right? One that I always find funny, right, is modern cameras on cell phones, right?
Yeah.
A camera has never been a 100% faithful representation of reality from the very beginning, right? But there's been certain accurate, as best you can within the limits of technology. Okay, well, this is what's being seen. Something that's happened in the past 10 years is camera technology has started to integrate aspects that make people more comfortable. And what I mean by that is it's very similar to how our brain smooths out the visual information in order to create something that is cohesive. People like to use cameras and smoothing effects to create an image of themselves that they find cohesive and pleasurable. And so it's pretty common to see people using this tool to get rid of wrinkles, right? To make them look a certain way. And my favorite one that always makes me laugh is when somebody takes a picture of themselves and their baby and they have this smoothing feature on, and then their baby is just a white circle with eyes because the baby has nothing to smooth away. So it smooths it into nothing but just an oval for its head. But that's something that wasn't possible previously, a decade earlier. And what does that do to our conception of reality when we can alter these things, right? Because I think that if you take that picture, right, and then you automatically apply this processing that provides you this image, you probably really start to think of yourself as this way.
I think you think of yourself this way, and think of the possibility. Think of yourself that way. If that way seems somehow, if it gives you pleasure, you may be happier with a moment in the day, whatever it is. And so has it served a psychological purpose, perhaps? But has it also served dominant notions of beauty and wrinkleslessness and extra fleshiness? And no. So it can be negative.
Yeah. And it comes back to illusion, right?
It is an illusion.
But the illusion itself isn't just... this isn't just something that the person is experiencing, because in the age of social media that we have, other people are viewing these photos, and with a little self-reflection, you'd understand, okay, this person spent time, being in the right light, getting the right angle of themselves, and using this processing in order to present the most flattering picture of themselves. But very rarely does that reflection happen. Instead, you see this picture and you think, wow, this person is a beautiful person. Mm-hmm. Or you start comparing yourself to them and that sort of thing. And the conversation you and I were having before the episode was talking about this. And this isn't just a visual, pictorial phenomenon. No. This is something that happens with people's interactions as well. People, and again, this isn't just the realm of philosophy. This is science. People represent themselves and they act in ways and they communicate in ways that are vastly different in an electronic format than they do in real life. And the end results of this are not always a good, positive thing. Mm-hmm. And what does that do to our shared reality when two people who may be vehemently, viciously, almost inhumanly opposed to each other in an electronic format could meet in reality and actually become friends? Yeah. And you and I provided back and forth scenarios that I've witnessed in real life, and that you saw on an upcoming
Super Bowl ad, right?
Yeah.
And I've certainly seen it happen in a classroom. I mean, this is when classrooms are I think at their high functioning moment. But you know what? When you're dealing with the idea of reality and illusion and perceptions, you are in a place where it's it's an uncomfortable zone. It's always uncomfortable for people to say, I may have been wrong. It's so much easier to say, I'm right all the time. You're wrong. You're the villain. I'm the hero. Yeah, but that's so boring. I'm not always right. And I am often wrong. I'm certainly not absolutely right. Perfectionism, for the most part, doesn't exist. People aim for it, but perfection itself as an overall, by its own definition, concept, not. We may think of people in our lives about as perfect as they could be, and that's different. That's our emotional take. So perfectionism can be very negative. Perfectionism is kind of idealism in a sense. And I have to go to the camera thing you were talking about, because one of my old friends is the brilliant artist with camera, but also an expert in camera, worked for Eastman, as many other places. I know another photographer in Perry. And these guys, when they talk about the camera work, when you have the conversations, the very moment that you put your eye on a lens, you are seeing differently, because you're seeing only a certain amount. It sort of takes apart, it conceptualizes for us what we were talking about at the beginning. What I see is what I choose to see, in the sense that I've pointed the camera there. I've isolated that moment. The camera is always an artificial take on a moment. And the moment just keeps going on and things change. So what I took in that camera doesn't exist any longer. That moment that way, and even the fact that you whether you digitize it or you do black and white, you make the choices of the values. It's very easy to do with cell phones now, to experiment with filters, but it was still able to be done in the dark room. So, are you seeing absolute reality? Absolutely not.
Yeah, and this is something that I'm experiencing in the course I'm currently taking. I'm looking at statistics, and one of the principles in statistics when you're doing sampling is you have to make sure you have a big enough sample size, because if you don't, a very small number of values can skew whether or not there's a relationship between two variables. A picture is very much the same way, where, like you said, you're seeing a small square of the view. But if you zoom out even from that, our eyes are seeing maybe bigger than that square, but honestly, probably less focused. You're seeing a very small piece of focus in front of your eyes, and then your brain's sort of filling in your peripheral information. Mm-hmm. And then if you zoom out farther, you realize that we're seeing a very small sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum. So there's actually much more out there than we're even seeing. And you can keep going out there and keep expounding on this until you realize, which is the humbling point of philosophy, that you know very little about anything at all, right? Yeah. And that's an extremely uncomfortable thing. And we've used all kinds of metaphors about, swimming on this ocean in a tiny boat and that sort of thing. And they're all true. But, coming back to what the social media thing, right? Yeah. One of my best friend in the world, I met in one of your classes, and we didn't like each other when we first met. We like to tell the story because it was your first class. I remember showing up and I was the first person there. Yeah. And I sat in the front row and I had my notebook and my pencils all organized, and I had my nice haircut, my clean clothes and stuff. And then everybody filled in, and then the class started. And then about 15 or 20 minutes later, this kid busts in the door, wearing sunglasses inside, fingerless gloves, a leather jacket, just kind of off the cuff. Oops, sorry, that he's late. Makes a whole bunch of noise as he's walking across the room, slumps into a chair in the back. And I remember thinking, man, who is this guy? What is his problem? And I found out later that this kid, my best friend, Jake, he said, yeah, I walked in, I saw this kid that, looked all like a goody two-shoes, and I thought, well, what's this guy's problem, right? So that was our initial thought of each other. What's this guy's problem? And then, through your class and after class discussions and stuff, we started to realize that there was a lot of things that we had in common, and there was just as many things that we were diametrically opposed about.
Mm-hmm.
But that made for fascinating conversations, and we're still that way to this day.
Yes.
Jake is still an extremely extroverted, emotional individual, and I'm still a very reserved. He refers to me as a robot. He says I'm his robot friend, and he asks if I need an oil change or all these different things, right? But through the interactions we've had with each other over the past 15 years, we've changed each other's perspective about things, right? And we've grown as people, and we've had a completely different perception of a shared reality than we would have had if we had never met each other, right?
Yes. And what was your initial view of each other totally outside the realm of reality? No, you're not a robot, and he's not a totally chaotic person. But you saw one element, as you said. Yeah, you've hit it. I mean, this is really for me the most fundamental point of a classroom, of a friendship, of a lifetime relationship, is that you're not. Well, I'm going to do that ought or should. I think that. The idea that you ought to try to make the person like yourself, or that you should become more like that other person, are destructive in a number of ways. We are human beings, and we are therefore as complicated as we recognize in ourselves that we are. In the time and space in which we are living now, suppose we all just assumed for just a moment that everybody is doing. My wife and I talk about this frequently. What if all of us are really doing the best that we can under the circumstances? And we start with that as an operating principle. There are things one wants to attack. There are things that one finds ethically egregious. But that doesn't mean you can't have the conversation or attempt the conversation. But it does require somebody else to be willing to say, okay, yeah, I'll have a conversation. But that means not, I'll pretend that I'm listening to you, then I'll bash what you've said because I, of course, am right. That's not a conversation.
Yeah, and that's the big problem, right? Is we're observing these things and we're studying these things within the realm of human relationships, and what we're finding is that the way that people have conversations is vastly different if you're doing it face-to-face versus if you're doing it through technological means, and that the technological means are not facilitating that same sort of back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
Which brings us to the last topic, and this is something that we referenced in the past, a David Chalmers article talking about virtual reality, in which he says virtual reality is reality,
mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many different aspects of that argument you could look at, but and we can, but I think the first one that we could start with based off of what we've said so far is, so if I met Jake, right, in an online class and in a discussion forum or something, my relationship with him, my views of him would be completely different. And the way in which we interacted when we had differences of opinion might have led to a different relationship and a completely different outcome. And so when you look at this happening on a societal level, on a global level, and you see that the way things are going, the way human interaction is changing, just because it's happening technologically or in virtual reality doesn't change the fact that this is kind of what our shared reality is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that was sort of, I don't know that Chalmers referred to that in his article. He was taking a different view, but maybe we can start going into that view a little bit.
Yeah.
You wanna add anything to that part of? If I know the article was a few weeks ago, so we're reaching.
Well,
back
I think that the essence of it is to once again come to, I think we can't stop trying to define the word reality. We say virtual reality. Well, what are we saying? A reality that sort of exists? Are we saying a reality that is parallel to our own? Or are we saying a reality that is created through the filter of technology? And I think Chalmers explores all of those things, but the necessity of calling it reality instead of just virtual suggests that there is a larger reality that encompasses all the different smaller ones.
And it comes back to, the whole episode, like, we still can't define reality even after this whole hour and 5 minutes.
Yeah, but right? I want to hear you do that stodgy one again, just so that
because
things that really exist.
Because really, reality TV should be called virtual reality TV, right? That would probably be more accurate. But virtual reality, I'm probably not wrong in saying Chalmers would agree with you and I when he says that imagination and idealism and these sorts of things don't exist outside of reality, like that other description that I was talking about said.
Yes,
they are an integral part of our reality, because if they weren't, then sure, virtual reality wouldn't be reality. It would just be a sensory bombardment, and our brain is developing something that makes sense, but it's not really out there.
Yeah.
But as we just discussed over the past 15, 20 minutes, the way that people interact with each other and the way that they develop opinions and the way that they think and the reality that they construct is different because of this virtual environment. Therefore, it is reality.
Yes, it is. And that's why the words are important. The reality is being created by the words. He has essentially he's postulating a new branch of philosophy. He calls it technophilosophy. And technophilosophy applies itself to the idea of how the mediation of technology alters how we see things or how we experience things. But he does it amazingly. We'll talk more about Chalmers. There's much to talk about, including his newest book. But I am also have been, partly through my teaching and training, has been to think of that as, okay, an invitation to look at how all tools alter the way or mediate the way that we communicate. Suppose you're not suppose. I mean, you're a musician. My father is a mechanic. My father sees the world of tools in a very specific subset. But my relationship with him growing up was often mitigated by or mediated by the degree to which I felt competent or not about those tools. So the tools become perhaps a conversational way into more relationship with, or a way of keeping me out, not his fault, but my self-perception of not being able to be competent with these things. We're talking about, how we can limit ourselves with our own self-perceptions.
Yeah. That's a really fascinating take on it. And it's funny because I was just reading an article about this earlier. There was a really flashy title that said, "Who is the smartest person to ever live?" Right?
Mirror, mirror on the wall.
Right. And so, again, it's using kind of a shallow headline
my queen.
to explore some deep concepts, right? And so what they got into was, well, is there a difference between intelligence and being smart, and how do we define these things? And what the author ended up coming down to is, in their view, they said Isaac Newton was the smartest person to ever live. And the reason they gave was not just his intelligence and the ability of proficiency that he was able to achieve, but the breadth of that knowledge, right? So in their view, being an excellent mechanic is fine and good, right? But if you're just an excellent mechanic, right, it might limit the way that you can interact with new ideas and people with different backgrounds. And, Isaac Newton, I think Da Vinci would probably also be a worthy competitor, but it's for the same reasons, right? You look at both of these guys and you see the achievements that they had in mathematics and in the visual arts and in inventions and physics and these different things. And what you realize is that their intelligence and the way they're able to apply that to a breadth of different ideas provided them with a numerous amount of tools with which to engage not only in a shared reality, but with other people who had different realities and backgrounds.
The word for this is a polymath. A polymath is somebody who's really good at many things. And these folks that you're describing were polymaths. And part of the being good at many things means you're going to see things from a variety of angles. Therefore, you're going to see a variety of perceptions, all of which put together can create a larger whole. The whole is more than the sum of its parts. Would perhaps be a very layperson kind of conceptualization of reality.
Yeah.
There are all these smaller things, but somehow there's this bigger whole that's bigger than all those small things together.
Right. So our conception of why we consider these guys to be so smart is because they might be the blind man holding the elephant's trunk, but then they walk down the rest of the elephant and they realize that there's something bigger there.
They are all 6 blind men together.
Right. And, are they ever going to, you ever going to have a full conception of reality? No. But again, it's an encapsulation of what we're trying to do as philosophers and what we're trying to do as people and trying to look at things objectively. And, even if we know that objective view isn't true, maybe trying to immerse ourselves in the subjectivity of other people and look at their experiences and walk all the way around the statue and see as much as there is to see, even if we'll never see the top of the head or the bottom of the feet or something, and we'll never know if it's hollow or solid or something, to get as much perspective as we can on what reality is and how other people view it and what's really out there. And it's a fascinating subject, and this is one of our longest episodes, and really all we did was just ask questions, but it's been a lot of fun, and I'm sure we're going to continue to talk about it in the future. So until next time, keep pondering.